For those who don't know me, I'm Father John Muir. I'm the pastor right here at this wonderful parish called St. Thomas Aquinas. And we're doing this Lenten series, which is kind of called #GettingMore. And just kind of exploring some different major areas that help us draw close to God. Think of the 40 days of Lent, patterned after Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness, this time of getting back to basics. And you may wonder, well, what in the world does questions about God's existence or atheism, etc., have to do with Lent? Maybe hardly anything could seem farther from Lent, but what's kind of on my mind tonight to present this talk to you is, do you remember the command that Jesus gives, the greatest commandment about loving the Lord your God? Sometimes we forget that one of the components of our being that we're called to love God with is our mind. Remember, he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your strength, all your soul, and all your mind, right? So our intelligence is an extremely important way in which God draws close to us and we draw close to God in this holy season of Lent. I think too here of the great line from the Gospel of John when he says, and then the Word became flesh. The word he uses there is like a word similar to logic or rationality. So the very mind of God comes into our midst. The Son of God became one of us. The Word becomes flesh. The logic of God became flesh, knowable. So it's good to do this, whether we consider ourselves believers or not believers in God, or kind of somewhere in the middle of those things. The title of the talk is Help for Your Atheist Friend. And you know the first atheist friend I have in mind is me. By that I mean me, personally, me, Father John Muir. I struggle with God's existence. What does it mean? How do we understand it? I grew up in a 20th and 21st century culture which spoon-fed me all sorts of arguments, both experiential and logical, that claim God doesn't exist. And I imbibed those to some degree, so I need this talk. So anyway, so pray for me. So I'm talking to myself. I'm your atheist friend. To some degree, there's there's corners of my being, maybe some large ones, that still are swayed by the claims of atheism. So pray for me. I hope I get something out of this talk. The second atheist friend I have in mind is you, parishioners of St. Thomas Aquinas, because you and I grew up in the same culture. None of us grew up in 13th century Italy. A show of hands if you did. Apparently not. All right, so here we are, right? We imbibe certain atmospheric conditions around us, just like our lungs take in certain things in the air around us, whether we like it or not. So when we think in this world, we take in some of the ambient ideas and worldviews. The third friend I have in mind is people that you know and love. Your beloved family members, friends, employees, people that you love that may consider themselves, full-blown atheists or kind of part atheists like some of us may be, whether we like it or not. You may say, well, Father, I'm a good Catholic. I'm not allowed to not believe in God. Well, look, faith in God, credo in unum Deum, I believe in one God like we say at Mass, is not some airtight filter in your mind against those philosophical things fluttering around the cognitive atmosphere. There's a man by the name of Joseph Ratzinger, you may have heard of him. He wrote a book I think it came out in 1968 called Introduction to Christianity. And in it he says that the believer, people who believe in God, the believer is choked by the salt water of doubt, constantly washed into his mouth by the ocean of uncertainty. It's an interesting image, isn't it, right? So when there's a culture which kind of believes in God, like a ship falls apart and you cling to one of these planks floating on the open sea, what's splashing into your mouth all the time but the reminder that you might sink? There's a philosopher, very wonderful contemporary Catholic philosopher by the name of Charles Taylor, who describes modern people in this day and age. By modern world, I mean the last 200 years specifically, the last 500 to 700 years a little more broadly. He described the kind of people in this world cognitively as buffered selves. You know what that means? You're buffered in on yourself. You tend to see the world as just a bunch of physical objects, and I'm cut off from them. The world's not a holy or enchanted place. It's a simple, cold, mechanistic place, and I tend to see myself cut off from others like a radical island, cut off from others, who are cut off from me, and then we're all cut off from whatever supernatural realm there may be. I mean, good for that supernatural realm and whatever little naked cherubim angels are flying around, but that doesn't mean anything for me at all. That's what the buffered self is. It's not just that, though. The help that I think a talk like this can provide, we'll get into some of the arguments for God. I'll mention 2 of them. But I think that's also helpful for anybody living in any age. Because when we talk about knowledge of God or knowing that God exists or knowing things about God, properties of God, etc., because God is just strange and different than created things, there's always going to be a challenge in knowing Him, just because of the nature of God Himself. You can pin a butterfly down, but you can't pin God down. So that makes Him a little harder to catch cognitively. And so that's a reality as well. I might list up to you any wonderfully pious Catholics who say, but isn't it sort of irreverent to even ask the question that God exists, It's like going to your mom or dad and saying, I don't even know if you're real, It's like, I'm right here. Well, just to give you confidence that we're on solid ground here tonight, Thomas Aquinas spent hundreds, if not thousands of pages of asking the question, utrum Deus sit. That means whether God exists. Mind you, he's a priest, right? If the answer to that question is no, he got to find a new job, right? So if a Dominican priest can ask the question for hundreds and thousands of pages whether God exists, maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. Let's go figure this out. Are there rational warrants for saying that God does in fact exist? If he can ask that, we can ask it. He's a saint and a doctor of the church. We're on solid ground, and he's a saint. And he loved asking the question, whether or not God exists. It's a holy question, everybody. It's not an irreverent one. Our faith longs to know better this great mystery. Okay? So I hope everyone here feels welcome and that we're not going to be beating up any atheists or anything like that, right? We're all human beings seeking to understand this great mystery. So here's the game plan if you want to keep track at home in your chair. I'm just going to make 3 recommendations. How to help engage the atheism in yourself and people around you. I'll make 3 recommendations. Then we'll just take a look at 2 arguments for the existence of God and how they function, maybe how we can get a little bit more out of them. Here's my first recommendation to help yourself and me and others, the atheists. First, make sure that you clearly define your terms. I find, whether it's on YouTube or in my own life as a priest, I remember this especially when I was working with college kids at ASU for 3 years as a chaplain there. So often there's certain words that get thrown around in these conversations, and the words are never defined, and it gets very muddy very quick. So can I just define maybe 4 or 5 key terms we'll be using? The first one is, guess what? God, right? Because atheism is going to mean not belief in God. So we just got to define, what in the world do we mean by God? There's a great Methodist theologian from Duke, I believe, named Stanley Hauerwas. He's in his 70s now. And sometimes when he would sneeze and people would say, God bless you, he'd say, which one? Right? And he meant that with kind of theological precision. Which God specifically do you want to bless me? Like, define your terms. You're talking about Thor? Or you're talking about another one? So let me define the term when we say God tonight. By that I mean the supernatural creator of the universe. In the Western tradition, we typically understand the supernatural creator of the universe as having certain properties. First, we say that he cannot fail to exist, meaning he's necessary. So this creator is necessary. He's a necessary being in his own existence. Secondly, we'd say because he created time, and time is a creature, he therefore cannot be conditioned by time, so we say that God is eternal. Even the word eternal just means outside of time, not conditioned or bound by time, right? The chronology of events, past, present, future. Thirdly, since space is a creature, then God must be outside of space. So we call that immaterial. We'd also add to that in the West normally that the creator, the supernatural creator of the universe is also all-powerful. Nothing limits his ability to act, and all-knowing. Nothing limits his ability to know. Now, I would say most theologians in the kind of the Western tradition, and I'm speaking here in broad strokes, would also add a quality of goodness or love. that this supernatural creator also has in himself the perfection of goodness or value, love in and of himself. So this means that God is not one being in a long list of other beings. This means that, how do we human beings typically know things? By contrast and comparison. A dog is like a cat, except it's different because it doesn't meow and it's friendly. So we contrast and compare. How do you know something if it's not in a category at all? Do you see the problem? So God's not limited by any categories. He himself is the source that creates all categories. So how can you know him? St. Augustine himself said it this way. I'll say it in Latin just because I want to impress you. Si comprehendis, non est Deus. If you understand it, it's not God. Right? Because the human intellect knows things by contrasting and comparing. And we know things in categories, a genus, a species. But God himself is the source of all genuses or genii and species. So if you say, I got it, I understand what God is. I understand. Because I'm contrasting and comparing him with other things. He's the biggest thing around. He's way bigger than supernovae. He's so much bigger than a blue whale. Well, then you're not thinking about God. So whatever you're thinking, that's not in the Western tradition what we mean by God. Still, there's a lot we can still say. There's a lot we can say about God. It doesn't mean God is just some big black emptiness. But it means that if we're just trying to say he's a being like us or a creature like us, then we're shooting the horse before it even gets out of the race. So is there a God? Does he exist? And he's just like us, and the horse just falls over. And you haven't defined the term right. But anyway, here's a couple of the terms. What's theism? It's the belief in a personal God, that personal God interacts with the world. Now, monotheists, there's different kinds of theists. There's monotheists, which believe there's only one of those. Polytheists believe that there's multiple gods. Deists, this won't be on the test, you don't have to write it down. Deists believe that there's one God who started the universe but no longer interacts with it. Think of a lot of the founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson. Now, monotheists, deists, and polytheists all believe that one God exists and that he's different from the created world. Even if a polytheist thinks there's other gods, like Thor or Hercules or Apollo, that there's still one God that's responsible for them. Pantheists believe that God is not supernatural, that he is co-identical with the universe. So God is the universe. The universe is God. They're simply equivalent, okay? Another term, now here's maybe the term we're focusing on a little bit more tonight. Atheism is the view that God does not exist. There's two kinds. I think you find this in practice just in our own lives and how we think and people we know. There's strong atheism and weak atheism. A strong atheism is, I'm sure that God exists. I know it's a fact. Weak atheism is, I think that God doesn't exist, but I just have sort of insufficient evidence to really nail it down. Another name for atheism can be naturalism. So naturalism is nature is all that there is. There's no supernatural realm above the natural world. Sometimes people call atheism materialism. Again, I'm throwing a lot of isms at you, but this is all just kind of setting the stage. Materialism and atheism are not the same thing because some atheists say, I don't believe in God, but I also don't believe that material stuff is all that there is. So materialism is, there's no such thing as an immaterial reality. But some atheists believe that there's a such thing as numbers or invisible concepts that are real, like justice. But they say, but I don't believe in God. So that would be an atheist who's not a materialist. Here's another one that's important. The nuns. You've heard this expression, the nuns that are on the rise, the fastest growing religious group in the United States? The nuns are the N-O-N-E-S, not nuns like the lady in a long veil, but the N-O-N-E-S, someone who says on a self-identification survey, what religion are you? Are you Christian, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, etc.? And they say, I'm none. I'm none of the above. I don't affiliate. They're not necessarily atheists. They may be atheists, but they may not be. Lastly, agnosticism. Have you heard of agnostic? I'm an agnostic. So agnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. It's a claim that there's a lack of knowledge about God. So there's a strong and a weak form. The strong form of agnosticism is that no one's able to know that whether there's a God or not. We're all out of luck, the whole human race. The weak form is, I'm out of luck, but I'm not sure about you guys. So that's the weak form of agnosticism. Here's the big difference. It's why we're going to focus a little bit more on the atheistic side of things. Agnosticism is a claim about a subjective view or feeling. It's not a claim about reality, objective reality. Atheism is, which is why it's easier to get a little bit more teeth with atheism. It's easier to talk about because you're not just talking about internal states, you're talking about fact. Anyway, so those are define the terms. I hope that didn't feel a little too heavy. It won't all be defining terms, but just important to get that right. Otherwise, we can be tripping in to, they can bump into each other and we can lose clarity from the get-go. After defining your terms, here's the second recommendation I'd make. Avoid common pitfalls and embrace helpful attitudes. Here's pitfall 1. Assume the person you know, assume that he or she is exactly what their label expresses. Man, I tell you what, this does not work. You can't assume things about people. Hey, I'm Catholic. Don't assume that they believe in God. I remember in my first year here, I was doing marriage prep, a Catholic guy marrying a woman, and I said, hey, tell me about your background in life and why you want to get married in the church. And I said, to the lady, tell me about yourself. And she said, I'm an atheist. And I said, okay, yeah, tell me more about that. Like, tell me about, your spirituality and what you think. And I got into the conversation with her, and I said, well, do you have a relationship with God? And she said, yes. And I said, tell me about it. She says, well, I trust God, and he takes care of me. And so what she's describing is that she's actually a theist, but she called herself an atheist because she had her own reasons. She didn't like the label theist. She didn't want to be called a Catholic or something. And I've met Catholics who say, I'm Catholic. Tell me about your relationship with God. Well, I grew up in the church, and my parents were Catholic. Well, tell me about your relationship with God. I don't think there is a God. There may be other issues there we need to talk about. And by the way, right, whenever you're dealing with a thing, it's never about winning arguments, proving ourselves right, or justifying the church, any of that stuff. It's about discovering the truth together. And so the great cliche, which I find is still true, our job is to win souls, including our own, right, to the truth and beauty and goodness that is real, not to win arguments. So you can win an argument, kind of lose a soul. Maybe a person needs to grow in trust. Maybe they need to grow in curiosity. Maybe they have an intellectual problem. You won't know if you just settle for a label. So don't settle for labels and ask questions about deeper questions to go below labels. Like your child comes home from college. I took a philosophy 101 class and I'm an atheist. Ah! I'm not paying your tuition! Take a breath and ask some questions, okay? Don't just settle for the label. Pitfall 2, assume an atheist has no good reasons for his view. He's just being a jerk. Okay, that's a pitfall to avoid. Don't do that, okay? Some atheists have phenomenal reasons for their views. Great, valid arguments. They may not be sound arguments, but they may be valid arguments that need to be addressed. The problem of evil. How can a good God allow bad things to happen in the world? You want a challenging argument for the God's existence. Name calling or being dismissive. Oh, all atheists are bad people. It's just not helpful. It's condescending. It doesn't build bridges. Here's another line from Joseph Ratzinger. It's the second half of the sentence I already quoted from that same book, Introduction to Atheism. Just as the believer is choked by the salt water of doubt, constantly washed into his mouth by the ocean of uncertainty, so the non-believer is troubled by doubts about his unbelief, that the world is a self-contained thing. It's good, isn't it? So we're all floating on the waters of doubt about our convictions, theists and atheists. So name-calling or judging or being condescending is just not helpful. Pitfall 3, connect an atheist's views with his personal morality. Don't you know Stalin was an atheist? I heard Hitler was an atheist too. Does anybody see the problem with that, okay? First of all, it's like a personal attack. Secondly, it's just making generalizations that aren't helpful at all. If morality comes up, the relevant question is not whether an individual atheist acts well or not, but whether an objective moral norms exist. So the question is not, can I be a good person without belief in God? That's not the important question. We all know people who are good people who don't believe in God. We know people who believe in God who do morally repugnant things. Those questions aren't helpful for the question for the existence of God. What's helpful is, can morality itself exist if God doesn't exist? So does that help a little bit as a pitfall? It can be tempting sometimes, but here's the, I'll mention this last pitfall and then charge forward. Ignore the atheist suffering. Just ignore it. Devastatingly bad move. There's a book that came out in 2012 by Greta Christina. It's called Why Are You Atheists So Angry? And she lists just shy of 100 grievances that atheists report having. You can sum them up in about 4 categories. It's 4 ways that atheists in this culture suffer, and we've got to be empathetic and sympathetic to it. The first one is atheists feel that they're compelled against their will by the state to practice religion. Secondly, they feel that the state endorses a particular set of religious beliefs. Think of in certain places where the state says you have to teach creationism, or the state prohibits same-sex marriage. Atheists tend to see that as an imposition on their freedom. Thirdly, religious people have ridiculous beliefs that lead them to hurt or dehumanize people. It's a common atheistic belief. Malpractice, right? That malpractice can be done against people who don't hold certain religious beliefs, that can lead to bullying or social rejection or even murder against people who hold atheistic beliefs. Fourth, you can kind of lump these grievances under this last category. Religious people believe things for such stupid reasons. They're just so stupid. Now, mind you, I'm not arguing for or against any of those claims. They're just what atheists say. I think there's actually some pretty darn good arguments. There are some religious people who believe things for pretty stupid things. I listened to this YouTube video from this Christian guy who was arguing about some nuanced thing about the nucleus or atoms, and he said, you know how that thing moves? Jesus is moving it. So what we can do here is when we acknowledge people's suffering, because the suffering is real, and we can really at least win some trust. Because sometimes atheists do get pushed around. Christians get pushed around. When an atheist is in the minority, they can sometimes feel really ostracized. When Christians are in a minority, American higher education, when Christians are in a minority, we get pushed around. So let's just call it a draw. Let's just empathize with each other's sufferings, and let's get back to questions that actually help us move closer to the truth. Okay, those are my first 2 recommendations. How about a third recommendation? Then we'll get into 2 of the arguments. Sound good? My third recommendation is view all the arguments for God's existence, and there's a lot of them. View all of them as rational paths towards knowledge of God, not mathematical proofs. God's not a mathematical equation, right? He's not a butterfly you can put under a microscope. I defined the term earlier, right? We'll get to more of that in a little bit. But our knowledge of God are paths to Him, not ways of jamming Him under our epistemological microscope. Again, what did Augustine say? If you understand it, if you comprehend it, it's not God. Nonetheless, there are rational paths to knowledge of God. Thomas Aquinas himself, you heard of the 5 arguments for God's existence for Thomas? What Thomas called the 5 proofs, he actually called in Latin the cinque viae. You know what the word viae means in Latin? Ways or paths, like a road. They're the 5 paths. They're not the only 5 paths, but they're 5 paths towards knowledge of God. Some of those paths are better than others. Some are pretty clinching. Some are not very clinching. Some have a strong kind of certainty to them. Some don't. Some are strong, valid, sound arguments, but maybe don't move some people. Some are maybe a little weaker in terms of the rational content, but they're like really emotionally powerful. One reason to get at this, because sometimes people will make the accusation, well, look, if you need all these arguments for God, isn't that a sign that it's actually kind of a joke? That like God is just this fable or this myth because you need all these arguments, right? Like how do you prove that, like, you know, there's a woman sitting in this crowd here tonight who's my mother, right? How do you prove that? Well, I just need a birth certificate, and that's evidence that she's Father John Muir's mom. And if you try to prove it in other ways, maybe she's not his mom, right? Here's an example. Think of like in the court of law, just in how civil law works, right? Murder mystery. We think that guy did it. And what's the prosecuting attorney going to do? But bring forward a whole host of paths of evidence and looking for converging probabilities. You know, there's the blunt object with the blood on it, and then there's a message on his cell phone, and in it comes. The fact that there's multiple lines of evidence doesn't decrease the likelihood of the conclusion. In fact, in a lot of cases, it can strengthen it, right? This maybe you're like disturbed or disappointed when you hear that and think, oh, I thought Father Muir was going to give us like A and then B equals God exists, and now I'm going to go just crush all my atheist friends. But take it away from the question of God for a second, right? And take it back to things more simple, like Mary Muir is my mom, right? Or it rained today in Phoenix. Or Hawaii is an island. How do you know those things? One of my heroes, John Henry Newman, the great convert to Catholicism in the 19th century, was very astute at investigating that question kind of from a philosophical perspective, especially so we could understand how we could say yes to God without kind of mathematical proof. What he saw was we all the time give assent to things without rock-solid mathematical evidence. Like England is an island, Hawaii is an island, this person is my mom. Because the way we assent to things is by taking in all of these different lines, again, back to the courtroom thing, all these lines of data. And we're seeking to make the best possible conclusion based on all this data. But just because we don't have a clinching argument doesn't mean we don't give absolute assent. We know things through a whole kind of experience, a kind of collage of hunches, intuitions, yes arguments, relationships, feelings, memories. The knowledge of something is like the sum total of all these possible aspects. Now, if that's true of any created thing, it's even more true of God, right? So here's the distinction here can be between absolute comprehension and a basic understanding. I don't know much about science. I was always better at like English and stuff, but I remember, learning the basics about chemistry and how like compounds work and that kind of thing. I have a basic understanding of it. But I am like not even anywhere close to any kind of comprehension. I'd humiliate myself and my high school teacher in chemistry if I tried to show you some kind of full comprehension. That doesn't mean I don't have a basic understanding or I assent to, yes, there are chemical realities at work in the world. Do you see what Newman is so helpful at understanding? That we don't just play this game of if I have just inferential data that's clinching, then I give clinching assent to saying it's true. Because that's just not how human beings actually operate. We don't actually do that. There's two ways a thing can be empty. Empty like a box and empty like a stomach. How are they different? A box is just dumbly empty, right? Cardboard, empty box. Put stuff in it, stuff sits there. How's the stomach empty? It knows what it wants, and when it gets what it wants, it starts working on it, right? The stomach starts interacting with it. There's a great 20th century Jesuit named Bernard Lonergan, who loved Newman, by the way. And he wrote this massive book called Insight, and it was all on how we know things. And he said, the mind is like a stomach, not like a box. The mind isn't just empty, and you just get this mathematical 2 + 2 = 4. I got it. Now I know it's 4. No. The mind is more like a stomach. It's like a busy animal. What's that? What is that? What color are those pants? What are you drinking in there? Why do you have stickers on that thing? Why are you wearing white shoes when it was raining today? What is that? What are those lights? Where do we get those extra chairs to that? Who are you people? And where'd you come from? And then you answer all those questions. Now I have more questions. The more I know, the more I want to know. The mind is like a hungry animal. It's interacting with the thing, and the more it gets, the more it wants. Thomas Aquinas, the reason I keep pointing over there is because his statues are over there in the church, so it doesn't. Thomas, I point there, wherever Thomas is now. Thomas said, the intellect, he called the intellectus agens. Again, fancy Latin for the agent intellect. Agent means it's doing things. It's doing things. I mean, to some degree, we're kind of a tabula rasa, right? We take things in like, oh, it's raining, it's sunny. But then very quickly, what starts happening with our minds? We start engaging. And if we don't, we really don't know what's going on in the world around us to any serious degree. I'm lifting all this up to you because it's true for just anything. If you want to be more alive in a human way, you want to be engaging things more intellectually, because that's what it means to be human. But it's true of the things of God too. It takes work, and that's part of the exciting aspect of it. That's why having multiple paths or multiple arguments for God's existence is so wonderful. Because it's ordered well to the way the mind actually works. Ooh, if those 5 arguments work, what are some other ones? Ooh, look at those, and that one kind of connects with this one, and I want to know more and more and more. So don't play the game of thinking the human mind is like a box, either for yourself or like other people. Well, I gave my roommate that argument from the textbook, and he said it was stupid, and he said God doesn't exist. Duh. Okay, all right. So you ate the porridge and you threw the porridge up. Yeah, so you're never going to eat ever again. Nope. You wouldn't do that with your stomach, so you don't do it with your mind. Try something else, right? We're trying to nourish our stomachs with food. We want to nourish our minds with truth. And we're different, right? People have different temperaments, different psychological makeups, different experiences, different desires. G.K. Chesterton wonderfully said, "A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still." Nice little poem, right? Yeah, that's a good argument. Do you believe it? No, because I don't like you. I remember being in seminary and like writing a paper. And I'm like, I love my argument. I'm going to argue blah, 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 blah. And I'm so convinced of it. And I read it here. And my friends like it. And I go to the professor. I'm like, I'm going to write this paper. And the professor like lifts one eyebrow and just goes, really? And I'm like, no, that's not a good idea. Yeah, but what's going on there, right? I'm convinced now that it's I think now it was a stupid idea. Why? I don't have any new data. What's changed? My relationship to my professor. So the way we know things is a lot more complex than just idea in a box. We just got to get past that, because it's not how human knowledge works. Lastly, I'll say in this recommendation, in terms of faith, in terms of knowledge, faith plays a role. Faith plays a role. Do you trust your teacher? Do you trust the person giving you the evidence? Like, do I have mathematical certainty Mary Muir is my mom? No. But like, I got these photo albums with pictures of someone that looks like her holding me as a baby. But do I trust that those pictures weren't doctored by the FBI? So there's a certain level of trust, right, that we have to bring in. Not just blind trust, right? I'm pretty sure they're real photographs. Hawaii is an island. Why do I know that? Have I ridden a kayak all the way around it? And how do I know that someone wasn't moving the island or tricking me, or some kind of psychological drug that was injected into my mind? Well, faith kind of circumscribes our reason and our approach to reality, and is in a kind of dynamic relationship with it. So we never just want to say to ourselves and our atheistic views, or to our friends or people who are struggling with atheism, you just got to have faith, man. You just got to have faith. That's a total cop-out, because faith and knowledge go together. They go together in knowledge of created things, and also in knowledge of God. Faith is not so much belief without reasons. That's credulity or superstition. It's not belief despite evidence. That's, I don't know, there's probably a mean name I could think of that, but that's definitely not faith. Faith is rather, think of it as a kind of trust based on good reasons. Trust based on good reasons. That's why relationships matter so much for how we see the world and how we see any truth, especially the truth of God.